I begin this story with danger, because that is how Enoch began to live, not in a neutral or spiritually open world, but in a time when walking in the wrong direction could cost one's life, and the wrong direction in that world was precisely walking with God. For the earth was no longer merely imperfect, it was consumed by open violence, bloody disputes, vengeances that spanned generations, and men who had learned that might was the only law that truly worked, so that anyone who refused to live like that became strange, suspicious, and often disposable. And while cities grew, tools were transformed into weapons, and alliances were broken without remorse. The risk was not only outside, it was in the air, in the suspicious gaze of others, in the silent certainty that living differently would demand paying too high a price. While Cain's lineage raised cities, celebrated conquests, and took pride in its own prowess, there was another group living almost on the fringes of visible history, not because they were weak, but because they had chosen to remember something the world wanted to forget, and that something was a God who still saw, still spoke, and still grieved. And this memory was not comfortable, it was heavy, because it constantly reminded them that man was not master of himself. And I imagine how much daily tension this created, for it was not a matter of two cultures separated by distance, but of two paths that crossed all the time, in the fields, on the trails, in inevitable encounters, forcing each person to repeatedly choose whether to live by strength or by faith. Jared, Enoch's father, had already seen too much, had buried acquaintances, watched brutality grow, and realized that his sons would face a world harsher than the one he himself was born into. And when Enoch came into the world, he came surrounded not by promises, but by uncertainty, because growing up in that time meant learning too early that remaining righteous required courage, and that faith brought not applause, but isolation. And this matters deeply, because Enoch did not choose to walk with God in a protected garden, but in an environment where each step in that direction increased the distance between him and the rest of the world. From an early age, Enoch began to feel something he couldn't explain, a silent unease as he observed violence accepted as normal, ambition treated as virtue, the total absence of reverence being mistaken for freedom. While others learned to adapt to survive, he felt a growing discomfort within him that couldn't be resolved by any distraction, as if his soul perceived before his mind that something essential was wrong. This sensitivity, far from being an easy gift, became a burden, because seeing what no one else wants to see almost always leads to loneliness. There is something profoundly human here, because before Enoch walked with God, he had to deal with the pain of not fully belonging, of not being able to blend in without getting lost. And this kind of internal conflict doesn't appear in historical records, but it shapes destinies, because those who sense too early that the world is broken have to decide whether to numb themselves like everyone else or remain awake, even knowing that this brings anguish, silence, and unanswered questions. And it is at this point that the story begins to tighten, because not every soul can bear to live awake in a world that has chosen to sleep. I imagine Enoch as a young man walking along the narrow paths that connected the fields to the villages, feeling in his own body the silent tension of that world, because there was no neutrality there. Each step carried an implicit choice. Each encounter demanded an inner stance, and even when no one said anything, glances said everything, for whoever did not align with the logic of force was seen as weak, suspicious, or useless. And this constant climate of surveillance shaped people's behavior from an early age, teaching them to hide doubts, silence their conscience, and harden their hearts to survive, so that growing up in that time meant learning not only to work the land or handle tools, but mainly to suppress any sensitivity that could be mistaken for fragility. While many young people learn to adapt quickly, absorbing the dominant values of that world without resistance, Enoch seemed to walk at a different pace, observing more than speaking, listening more than reacting, like someone who realizes that collective haste leads nowhere safe, and this posture, though silent, already made him different, because in a world that celebrates aggression, introspection is seen as a threat, and in an environment that values dominance, any sign of deep reflection sounds like dangerous questioning, something that cannot be easily controlled. Jared watched his son with discreet attention, not with explicit pride, but with a mixture of concern and recognition, because he knew, from the experience accumulated over the centuries, that certain types of spiritual sensitivity bring with them not only purpose but suffering, and he saw in Enoch signs of someone who would not be able to easily accommodate the demands of that world, someone who would feel too much, think too much, question too much, and this, at that time, was not seen as a virtue, but as a dangerous weakness, something that could attract contempt, rejection, and even violence. At family gatherings, when the elders came together to reminisce about old stories, to talk about the God who created all things and who once walked with man, Enoch listened with an attention that surpassed childish curiosity, because those narratives didn't sound to him like distant traditions, but like echoes of something lost, of a broken intimacy that still hurt even after so many generations. And the more he listened, the more he perceived the abyss between what was whispered and what he saw happening around him. For the world seemed not only distant from God, but comfortable in that distance, like someone who had become accustomed to the absence of light and had come to call the darkness normal. This perception created a growing conflict within him, because on the one hand, there was the deep human desire to belong, to be accepted, to walk without being constantly observed with suspicion. And on the other hand, there was a restlessness that did not allow him to fully surrender to the dominant flow, as if something within him refused to accept that this daily brutality was the natural destiny of humanity. And this internal tension, although silent, was exhausting, because living divided between adaptation and loyalty consumes forces that no one sees, but that profoundly shape character. As the years passed, Enoch began to naturally distance himself from the crowds, not out of contempt, but out of inner necessity, seeking spaces where the noise of violence and ambition diminished, places where the wind, the silence, and the rhythm of creation seemed to speak louder than human voices. And in those solitary moments, something began to happen within him, not as a spectacular revelation, but as a growing awareness that there was a presence that did not depend on temples, cities, or human systems, a presence that observed, waited, and remained, even when almost everyone had stopped seeking it. Here there is a profound reading of spiritual psychology that spans generations, because not every search for God begins with clear faith or religious language. Often it begins with discomfort, with inadequacy, with the persistent feeling that living merely to survive is not enough. Enoch was beginning to experience exactly that, an inner hunger that could not be satisfied by work, recognition, or security, a hunger that led him to question, still without words, whether humankind had been created only to repeat cycles of violence until disappearing from the earth. These questions were not shared openly, because in that world thinking differently was already dangerous, and verbalizing this kind of unease could attract immediate hostility. Therefore, Enoch carried much of his conflict in silence, learning early on that some battles are fought internally before any external confrontation. This inner solitude, though painful, began to prepare him for something greater. For those who learn to sustain silence amidst chaos develop a deeper listening ability, a rare capacity to perceive what others ignore. Enoch does not yet walk with God, has not yet received revelations, does not yet occupy any place of spiritual prominence. But something essential is already being formed within him. A silent disposition not to become numb, not to call normal that which wounds the soul. The tension that remains in the air is whether this young man will be able to sustain this sensitivity in a world that rewards precisely the opposite, or whether, like so many others, he will end up giving in to collective pressure to survive without conflict, even if it costs him his own essence. As time passed, what had begun in Enoch as a silent unease became a kind of inner weight that was difficult to ignore, because the more he observed the world around him, the more he realized that violence was not just a learned behavior, but a symptom of something deeper, an invisible rupture between man and that which gave him meaning. And this perception did not come as a moral accusation, but as pain, like someone who sees an open wound being treated as something normal and feels inside the anguish of knowing that ignoring it will not make it disappear, only infect it even more. There were times when Enoch tried to convince himself that perhaps he was exaggerating, that perhaps he was just too sensitive. After all, almost everyone seemed to live well that way, building, negotiating, dominating, celebrating their achievements. And this created a deep conflict within him, because human beings carry a natural tendency to doubt their own perception when it is not confirmed by the collective. And Enoch felt this internal pressure, this desire to silence his own conscience, to alleviate the loneliness. But something inside him resisted, as if his soul refused any agreement that required denying what he knew, even without being able to fully explain it. Jared perceived this silent struggle in his son, not through words, but through his gaze, through the way Enoch remained overly attentive, overly reflective, like someone listening to a distant sound that no one else seemed to hear. And although he loved him deeply, Jared also feared the path that lay ahead, because he knew, with the hard wisdom of someone who had lived for centuries, that there are callings that do not protect but expose, that do not bring applause but isolation, and that not every spiritual vocation is welcomed by the world as something beautiful. Often it is seen as a threat because it questions the normality that sustains entire structures. On certain days, Enoch would withdraw even further, walking through places where the human presence diminished, not out of rejection of people, but because he needed to breathe air, less burdened by dispute, less contaminated by ambition. And in these silent spaces, something began to organize itself within him, not as a ready-made answer, but as a gradual clarity, a growing feeling that life could not be just this, to be born, to fight, to dominate, and to disappear, as if all human effort were merely a desperate attempt to fill a void that no one wanted to admit existed. This inner process was not comfortable, because questioning the meaning of existence in a world that has already decided on easy answers requires emotional courage, and Enoch felt the weight of this courage growing day by day, realizing that the more he refused to numb himself, the more exposed he became, not necessarily to physical attacks, but to incomprehension, to distancing, to that kind of silent rejection that doesn't shout, but corrodes, because it doesn't come with explanations, only with looks that say you don't belong. Here lies a profound reading of the human soul that transcends time, because many turn away from God not out of conviction, but out of weariness, unable to bear the tension of living awake in environments that reward indifference. And Enoch was beginning to realize that the true danger lay not only in explicit violence, but in the normalization of emptiness, in the collective acceptance of a life without reverence, without listening, without transcendence, as if man had silently decided to live only for himself. As these thoughts deepened, Enoch also began to perceive something new, still undefined, a feeling of being observed not with judgment, but with attention, as if that inner restlessness were not a mistake, but an invitation. And this disconcerted him, because he had no religious language to explain this experience. There were no visions, no audible voices, only a growing awareness that the silence was not empty, that the absence of God proclaimed by the world might not be a real absence, but a chosen absence. This realization began to reorganize her way of seeing loneliness, because what had previously hurt as abandonment was slowly beginning to acquire another meaning, as if the distance from the crowds was creating space for something that had not yet fully revealed itself, but which already demanded attention, listening, and inner disposition. And this brought a new tension, because if that restlessness was truly a calling, answering it would mean crossing a boundary with no guarantee of return. Comfort or acceptance. Enoch has not yet made any visible decisions. He has not yet changed the course of his life externally, but something decisive is already at work within him, a silent preparation that does not attract attention, but which begins to separate the man he could be from the man he is becoming. And the question that remains open, pulsing beneath every sentence, is whether he will have the courage to answer this invisible call, knowing that crossing this threshold may mean losing what little belonging he still has left, without any immediate promise of reward. There was a moment difficult to pinpoint in time when Enoch realized that observing from a distance was no longer enough, because what had previously been mere unease was beginning to become an unbearable burden, as if ignoring that inner voice was costing more than confronting it. This realization wasn't accompanied by sudden courage, but by exhaustion, a profound weariness of feigning normalcy in a world that demanded constant adaptation to something his soul silently rejected. This is important because many spiritual decisions are born not from enthusiasm, but from exhaustion, when a person realizes that continuing as before is no longer a viable option. Enoch began to notice that the more he tried to adjust, the more distant he felt from himself, as if each small concession took away something he couldn't recover afterward. This feeling of inner fragmentation is one of the most silent pains of human experience, because it doesn't produce visible signs, but corrodes from within, creating a division between what is lived externally and what is known internally to be true. Enoch was beginning to understand, though without clear words, that living divided was a slow way of disappearing. In his encounters with other young people, in conversations about daily work, he realized how much people had learned to talk only about what was safe, repeating accepted ideas, reinforcing expected behaviors, avoiding any questioning that could generate collective discomfort. And this made him even more aware that that world was not only violent, but profoundly defensive, like someone who had built an entire identity so as not to have to face the emptiness that hid behind it. And this collective defense made any search for meaning something suspicious, almost an affront. Jared observed this process with respectful silence, because he had learned that certain journeys cannot be guided by direct advice, only accompanied from a distance. And although he wished to protect his son from unnecessary pain, he also knew that preventing someone from hearing their own calling is a more subtle but no less destructive form of violence. And so he remained attentive, present, but without interfering, recognizing that what was happening to Enoch could not be resolved by tradition, nor by fear, nor by human prudence. As the days passed, Enoch began to seek moments of solitude more frequently, not as an escape, but as a vital necessity, because only away from the constant noise could he clearly hear what was moving within him. And in those silent spaces, something began to align, as if scattered thoughts slowly found a common axis, a direction. And this direction did not point towards achievements, nor towards security, nor towards acceptance, but towards something simpler and at the same time more threatening. The inner truth that his life could not continue to be lived only in response to the world around him. There is a crucial point here, profoundly human and spiritual, because when someone begins to realize that their own identity is being shaped more by fear than by truth, an inevitable choice arises to continue protecting oneself or to begin aligning oneself, even without knowing exactly with what. Enoch was approaching this point, feeling that remaining numb was more comfortable in the short term but devastating in the long term, while staying awake would require facing loneliness, misunderstanding, and real risk without clear guarantees of reward. This inner tension also began to manifest itself in his body, in the way Enoch walked more slowly, spoke less, observed more, like someone about to cross an invisible threshold, aware that after that, nothing will be exactly the same. And this creates a specific kind of fear, not the fear of something external, but the fear of changing internally, because changing from within means accepting that the previous life, with all its adaptations and concessions, will no longer be enough. Enoch is being prepared for a choice that will not be publicly announced, celebrated, or understood. A silent but irreversible choice to begin living in alignment with that which he cannot yet fully name, but which he already recognizes as more real than any human approval. The tension that lingers is whether he will have the courage to take that first invisible step, knowing that every true journey begins when one abandons the illusion of control and accepts walking without guarantees, only with fidelity to that which one's own soul knows to be true. There comes a point in life when silence ceases to be merely the absence of noise and transforms into confrontation. And for Enoch, that moment began when he realized that it was no longer possible to attribute his restlessness solely to his surroundings, because even on days when everything seemed calm, when there were no visible conflicts or immediate threats, that feeling persisted, firm, constant, like an inner presence that wouldn't leave. And this led him to understand something disconcerting, that the problem wasn't just the violent world he lived in, but the growing distance between what his soul sought and the way his life was organized. Enoch then began to pay attention to his own thoughts, not to judge them, but to understand them, realizing how many of them were shaped by the fear of rejection, the need for acceptance, and the silent adaptation to the expectations of others. This internal observation was not comfortable because it revealed how much he, like everyone else, had learned to adjust his identity in order to survive, and recognizing this required humility, for it meant admitting that, even without agreeing with the violence of the world, he still lived reacting to it, allowing it to define his limits, his choices, and even his silence. This process brought to light a deeper pain, the realization that living only by reacting to the environment is a subtle form of slavery, because even those who consider themselves different can end up trapped in the same internal structures they criticize, and Enoch began to feel that his restlessness was not a flaw, but a call to leave this reactive state, to stop being just someone who resists internally and become someone who consciously chooses a direction, even if that direction was unknown and risky. There were days when this clarity almost frightened him, because consciously choosing implies taking responsibility, and responsibility always carries with it the weight of consequences. And Enoch knew that any more explicit movement towards what he felt could put him in direct opposition to the world around him, not only spiritually, but practically, socially, and emotionally, because at that time there was no neutral space. Every choice was read as a position, and every position generated a reaction. It was in this context that he began to wonder, for the first time directly, albeit silently, whether that God he had heard about since childhood could still be sought, not as an inherited tradition, but as a living presence. This question did not arise as a declaration of faith, but as a risk, because asking was already dangerous, already breaking the silent agreement of living without confronting the void. Enoch felt the weight of this question echoing within him, opening a possibility that once considered could no longer be ignored. These thoughts increasingly led him away from ordinary routines, seeking places where he could remain unobserved, not out of immediate fear, but out of a need for truth. Because certain questions require space to be formulated honestly. And in these solitary moments, Enoch did not perform rituals, did not repeat ancient formulas, did not try to provoke spiritual experiences. He simply remained, attentive, willing, like someone who does not know exactly what he is looking for, but knows that he can no longer pretend to be satisfied with the answers that the world offers. There is something profoundly therapeutic here, because many people believe that faith begins with certainty, when in fact it often begins with willingness, with the courage not to run away from difficult questions. And Enoch was exactly at that point, willing to face the possibility that his restlessness was, in fact, an invitation, and that ignoring it would mean remaining fragmented, while answering it would require crossing unknown territory, without maps, without guarantees, and without external validation. This inner disposition began to reorganize his perception of time and life, because he began to see each day not only as survival, but as an opportunity for alignment. And this silently changed his choices, the way he reacted to provocations, how he dealt with the violence around him, how he positioned himself internally in the face of injustices that he had previously only observed. And although none of this was yet visible to others, something decisive was already happening, an inner transition that separated the man who only resisted from the man who was beginning to choose. Enoch has not yet uttered audible words to God, has not yet heard clear answers, has not yet radically altered his external routine, but a door has been opened within him, the door of willingness. And this is more significant than it seems, because every real spiritual journey begins when someone accepts that they have no control over the outcome, but decides, even so, not to turn away from the calling. And the tension that remains now is whether Enoch will take the next step, the one in which silent willingness begins to transform into conscious seeking, knowing that from then on, a return to indifference will no longer be possible. There was a day when Enoch realized that merely being willing was no longer enough, because willingness without action begins to transform into procrastination, and procrastination, when repeated, becomes an elegant form of escape. This realization deeply troubled him, for he began to understand that the restlessness he carried was not there merely to be felt, but to be answered, and that continuing to live as if nothing were happening within him would be a silent betrayal of what had begun to form inside him. This understanding did not come as comfortable clarity, but as a burden, because responding to an invisible calling requires courage to act without guarantees, and Enoch knew that in that world, any movement towards God would be interpreted as distancing oneself from men, and distancing oneself from men meant losing protection, access, belonging, and, in many cases, basic security. So the simple act of seeking God was not only spiritual, it was profoundly existential, laden with practical consequences that he could not ignore. It was then that Enoch began, still discreetly, to set aside specific moments to withdraw completely, not just to think, but to remain in conscious silence. This was unlike the formal religious gatherings of his community, nor the stories repeated around the fire. It was something simpler and, at the same time, more vulnerable, because in those moments he did not rely on ancient words or inherited traditions, but simply placed himself before the silence with the intention of not fleeing from it. And this, in itself, was already a gesture of faith in a world that had learned to fill every void with noise. During these periods of seclusion, Enoch did not experience immediate answers. There were no external signs or visible confirmations, only a growing perception that this silence was not indifferent, and this perception disconcerted him, because he began to feel that his search was not one-sided, as if that which attracted him was not only waiting to be found, but also observing, awaiting his approach. And this feeling brought with it both comfort and fear. For being seen is comforting, but it also demands truth. As the days passed, this silent practice began to shape his way of being in the world, because Enoch became less reactive, less impulsive, less molded by external tensions, and although this did not make him immune to the violence around him, it began to create within him a more stable inner axis, something that did not depend on collective approval or constant fear. And this is significant because every walk with God begins first on the inside rather than on the outside, creating an invisible structure that supports visible choices at the right time. Jared noticed this subtle change, not because Enoch spoke about it, but because his presence began to carry a different kind of stillness, a silent firmness that didn't need to impose itself. And this awakened mixed feelings in Jared, because while he recognized a rare maturity there, he also feared the path that this firmness might require, knowing that internally aligned people tend to provoke discomfort in systems built on fear and violence. There is a profound principle of spiritual psychology here, because when someone begins to align themselves internally without yet making public declarations, the world around them usually reacts instinctively, not necessarily with direct attacks, but with estrangement, distancing, and silent pressure for the person to return to behaving as before. Enoch began to feel this type of reaction. More attentive glances, interrupted conversations, a diffuse feeling that something within him had changed, even without words. This tested his resolve, because remaining internally aligned while the environment pressures for conformity requires continuous emotional resistance. Despite this, something within him no longer allowed for a complete return, because the experience of remaining silent before God, even without clear answers, had produced a subtle but irreversible transformation. The awareness that his life could be lived in relation, not just in reaction, and this awareness changes everything, because whoever discovers the possibility of a relationship with the Creator can no longer be satisfied with an existence shaped only by survival and adaptation. Enoch does not yet openly walk with God. He has not yet received revelations. He has not yet become a spiritual reference for anyone, but something decisive has already happened. He has stopped merely enduring the restlessness and has begun to respond to it with seeking. And this marks a point of no return, because seeking God, even in silence, even without guarantees, is already a choice that redefines priorities, breaks internal agreements, and prepares the ground for encounters that will transform not only his own life, but the course of human history. And the question that remains now, sustaining the tension, is how this God will respond to a man who has finally decided not to run away anymore. There came a point when Enoch realized that his silent search had begun to alter not only his inner self, but also how the world reacted to his presence. Because when someone begins to live from a more aligned inner axis, even without words or declarations, it creates a kind of invisible displacement around them, as if the person no longer perfectly fit into the same implicit agreements that sustain common coexistence. And Enoch began to feel this displacement in small things, in conversations that became shorter, in glances that lingered a little longer than necessary, in heavy silences that arose when he approached. This type of reaction didn't come from open accusations or direct confrontations, but from something more subtle and therefore more exhausting, a kind of silent pressure for him to become predictable, adaptable, easily classifiable again. Because systems built on fear and violence don't tolerate well what they can't name or control. And Enoch was beginning to understand in practice that seeking God wouldn't immediately make him safer in the eyes of men, but stranger, harder to categorize. And this demanded continuous emotional courage from him, not to face attacks, but to endure the gradual estrangement. At the same time, something profoundly new was happening within him, a growing sense that his search was not being ignored, even though there were no clear answers or visible manifestations, as if each moment of conscious silence was being recorded, welcomed, considered, and this perception changed the quality of the waiting, because waiting without knowing if someone is listening is one thing, but waiting feeling that there is attention on the other side is completely different, as it transforms the waiting into a relationship in gestation, into preparation for something that is not yet revealed, but is already subtly announcing itself. Enoch began to realize that in moments of reflection, his thoughts ceased to revolve solely around his discomfort with the world and began to organize themselves around a presence, not in the sense of images or words, but of inner guidance, as if his consciousness was slowly being adjusted to perceive something that had always been there, but which had previously been muffled by the constant noise of survival. This produced a delicate yet profound change, because he was no longer seeking merely relief from his restlessness, but truth, even if that truth demanded transformation. Here lies a crucial point in spiritual psychology, because when someone begins to genuinely seek God, the focus of the question shifts from, "How can I live better in this world?" to "Who am I becoming as I live?" And this change is decisive, as it shifts attention from external control to internal integrity. And Enoch began to feel this shift happening, realizing that his identity no longer depended so much on the acceptance of others as on the coherence between what he felt and what he chose. This inner coherence, though still fragile, began to bear silent fruit, because Enoch became less susceptible to provocation, less impulsive in the face of injustice, not out of indifference, but out of discernment, like someone who begins to realize that not every reaction is a response, and that not all resistance needs to be noisy to be firm. And this altered his presence in the world in an almost imperceptible but consistent way, creating a difference that did not shout, but remained. Jared observed all of this with a mixture of reverence and concern, because he recognized signs of a calling that transcended normality, something that was not limited to common piety or family tradition, but pointed to a more direct, riskier, more demanding relationship. And although he wished to protect his son, he also knew that certain paths cannot be interrupted without causing profound harm, because preventing someone from pursuing an authentic quest often pushes them into a life of resentment and fragmentation. Enoch finds himself in a delicate state, no longer satisfied with indifference, but still without fully experiencing the answer that his search seems to promise, living in this intermediate space where faith is not yet certainty, but is no longer just a possibility. And this space is uncomfortable because it demands perseverance without guarantees, fidelity without immediate reward, and a willingness to keep walking even when nothing visible seems to happen. And the tension that sustains the narrative now is whether this silent search will finally be answered, or whether Enoch will have to decide how far he is willing to go before hearing any clear sign from the one he began to seek. There was a day when silence ceased to be merely space and became an encounter, not suddenly or spectacularly, but in such a natural way that Enoch only realized what was happening after it had already happened, because there was no announcement, no visible rupture of the sky, No signs that would attract the attention of other men, only a deep, clear and inescapable awareness that he was no longer alone in that seclusion. And this perception did not come as fear, but as recognition, like when someone finally finds what they had been searching for without knowing exactly what it would be like. Enoch did not hear an audible voice at that first moment. He saw no form before him, but he felt something even more unsettling. The unmistakable sensation of being completely known, not just observed, but understood on levels that no human relationship had ever reached. This made him realize that all the restlessness that had accompanied him since youth was not a rejection of the world, but an attraction to something greater, and that this silent search had not been a movement into the void, but a progressive response to a presence that had always been there, waiting for him to stop running away. This recognition had a profound effect, because Enoch realized that he no longer needed to defend himself internally. He didn't need to justify his difference, nor explain his loneliness, because all of that made sense in the light of this presence. And this brought a peace unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not a peace that numbs, but a peace that aligns, that organizes, that puts everything in its place, including the pains, the fears, and the questions that previously seemed disordered. At that moment, Enoch understood something essential, that seeking God did not mean escaping the world, but learning to walk within it from a different perspective. This understanding struck him powerfully because he realized that his sensitivity, his restlessness, and his refusal to become numb were not weaknesses to be corrected, but instruments that needed to be tuned. And this tuning began there, in that silent encounter that could not be explained, only experienced. From that day forward, something changed in the way Enoch moved through the world, not externally, but internally, because he began to carry with him a constant awareness of presence, as if the God he had sought in silence was now continuously near, not restricted to moments of reflection, but accompanying his steps, his decisions, and even his thoughts. This profoundly altered his relationship with time, with work, and with people, because everything began to be experienced in the presence of someone, and no longer just in the face of human expectations. This new inner state also brought a different weight, because along with peace came clarity, and clarity almost always demands responsibility. For Enoch began to perceive more clearly the distance between the heart of God and the way the world had chosen to live. And this perception did not generate superiority, but pain, a pain similar to that of someone who sees a safe path being ignored while many head towards danger. And this pain began to mix with compassion, something he did not yet fully understand, but which began to shape his view of others. Jared noticed the change in his son, not because Enoch had said anything specific, but because his presence had acquired a new depth, a firm serenity that could not be explained by mere human maturity, and this awakened in him a silent respect, for he recognized their signs of a relationship that transcended family tradition, something that could not be taught or inherited, only lived. And although this brought pride, it also brought fear, because he knew that men who walk this path rarely remain invisible for long. There is a spiritual principle here that runs through human history, because when someone begins to live consciously of God's presence, even without announcing it, that awareness begins to shine through, not as discourse, but as posture, and the world perceives it even if it doesn't know how to name what it perceives. Enoch was beginning to experience this, more intense reactions around him, both of curiosity and discomfort, because his way of being no longer completely fit into common patterns, and this signaled that the journey that had begun in silence would soon have visible implications. Enoch is not yet called a prophet. He does not yet announce judgments. He does not yet occupy any prominent place, but something definitive has already happened. He has stopped merely seeking and has begun to live in relationship. And this transition changes everything, because walking with God does not begin with public words, but with constant inner alignment. And the tension that remains now is how this silent relationship will manifest itself in a world that does not tolerate well, that which exposes its own distance from God. For from here on, Enoch's journey can no longer remain hidden for long. After that first silent recognition of God's presence, Enoch realized that the relationship that had begun to form was not limited to specific moments of recollection, but required continuity, because it was not an isolated experience, but a new way of existing. This understanding brought with it an unexpected responsibility, for living consciously of God's presence meant allowing that presence to permeate every detail of daily life, reorganizing priorities, choices, and even silences. This, far from being comfortable, began to expose internal conflicts that had previously remained hidden. Enoch began to notice how many of his actions, even those that were socially acceptable, were shaped by fear, convenience, or a desire to avoid conflict, and this realization deeply troubled him because he could no longer act automatically without feeling the weight of inconsistency, as if the presence that accompanied him illuminated not only his successes but also his most subtle concessions. And this light came not as condemnation but as a constant invitation to integrity, something that requires continuous inner vigilance and a willingness to change even when no one else notices. This inner vigilance began to transform his routine in a practical way, because Enoch started choosing more solitary paths, quieter times, less obvious decisions, not out of a desire to isolate himself, but because he realized that certain conversations, environments, and alliances weakened that awareness of presence that was beginning to sustain his life. And this gradual distancing, although necessary, had a high emotional cost, as it meant giving up familiarity, superficial bonds, and the feeling of normality that protects from the critical gaze of others. Those around him began to notice this change more clearly, not because Enoch had become strange or hostile, but because his attitude ceased to reinforce the unspoken agreements that maintained predictable coexistence. And this generates discomfort, because when someone refuses to participate in certain dynamics, even without explicitly denouncing them, they end up revealing their fragility. And Enoch felt this discomfort growing around him, manifesting itself in distancing, veiled comments, and a curiosity mixed with suspicion. Jared, with his long experience, recognized what was happening, for he had seen throughout the centuries how men who draw closer to God inevitably begin to distance themselves from certain human structures, not out of contempt, but out of incompatibility. And although he wished to protect his son from the consequences of this path, he also knew that there was no safe return once someone began to live in deep alignment with their inner truth. Because trying to go back after that usually generates an even greater rupture, an almost unbearable inner division. As the days passed, Enoch began to realize that this constant presence not only accompanied him, but also guided him, not through audible commands, but through an increasingly clear inner guidance that led him to avoid certain places, to remain in others, to observe situations of injustice and violence more attentively. And this silent guidance began to shape his view of the world, for he no longer saw only isolated behaviors, but patterns, cycles, and consequences that repeated themselves, as if he were being trained to see reality from a broader perspective. This broadening of perception brought with it a new pain, because Enoch began to feel more deeply the weight of widespread corruption, not as moral indignation, but as lament, as someone who sees a path of destruction being followed collectively, and knows that few are willing to change direction. And this lament was not passive. It began to transform into an inner urgency, still silent, but increasingly present, preparing the ground for something that Enoch did not yet fully understand. There is an essential aspect of walking with God that is often overlooked, because closeness brings not only comfort, but also emotional responsibility. The closer someone gets to God's heart, the more they begin to feel what he feels. And Enoch was increasingly experiencing this, realizing that his inner peace coexisted with a deep sadness for the human condition. Sustaining these two realities simultaneously required spiritual maturity that only develops with perseverance. As time went on, this conscious walk began to become more frequent, more integrated, less dependent on specific moments, as if each step, each decision, and each silence began to happen before God. And this constancy transformed Enoch from the inside out, making him someone whose life could no longer be explained solely by personality traits or family heritage. For there was in him a new coherence, a silent integrity that began to stand out amidst the general instability. Enoch is no longer merely searching, nor merely in an initial encounter, but in continuous motion, learning to walk with God at the rhythm of real life, carrying both the peace of presence and the weight of the clarity it brings. And the tension that remains now is how this silent walk will transform when inner clarity begins to demand outward expression. For the moment will come when that which Enoch lives in silence can no longer remain hidden in a world that refuses to be confronted. As Enoch's walk with God became more constant, something inevitably began to shift within him, because living in continuous relationship with the divine presence does not allow truth to remain merely a private experience for long. Even though Enoch did not seek to stand out, nor did he have any desire to become a public voice among his generation, he began to realize that silence was no longer enough at all times, as there were situations in which remaining silent meant agreeing. And this realization placed him before a new and more dangerous conflict than all the above. This conflict did not arise as an impulse to confront, but as an inner weight, because Enoch felt a growing urgency within him that did not come from personal indignation, but from the clarity acquired by walking with God, a clarity that made him see with painful precision the path of collective self-destruction that had become normalized. And this vision did not make him feel superior, but responsible, like someone who sees an imminent danger and needs to decide whether to continue walking in silence or to accept the cost of warning others, knowing that warning almost always generates resistance. There were times when Enoch found himself confronted with acts of violence treated as entertainment, disputes resolved by force being celebrated as proof of power, and alliances built on exploitation being justified as necessity. And in those moments he felt a physical discomfort, as if something inside him rebelled against the idea that this could continue to be called normal. And this inner reaction surprised him, because it was no longer just a matter of personal sensitivity, but a profound coherence between what he perceived in the presence of God and what he saw happening before his eyes. It was in small, almost imperceptible moments that Enoch began to break the silence, not with long speeches or direct accusations, but with simple words, questions that destabilized, observations that interrupted the normalization of violence, and these discreet interventions were already enough to generate intense reactions. Because when someone speaks from deep conviction, even a few words carry weight. And Enoch was beginning to experience this. Eyes closing, conversations ending abruptly, and a growing feeling that his presence was no longer neutral. People couldn't explain exactly what bothered them, but they felt that something had changed, because Enoch no longer participated in certain dynamics with the same ease, no longer laughed at the same things, no longer reinforced the same narratives that justified brutality as inevitable. And this created a silent tension, because the simple fact that someone refused to call evil good exposes the fragility of collective justifications, and few are willing to face this without reacting defensively. Jared clearly perceived that his son's path was entering a new phase, more dangerous and more solitary, because now the walk with God was beginning to produce visible fruits, and visible fruits attract attention, both from those seeking hope and from those who feel threatened. And although Jared wished to protect him, he also knew that true integrity cannot be contained by excessive prudence, for trying to preserve someone from their calling often results in suffocating that which gives them life. There is a profound and timeless spiritual principle here, because when someone walks with God long enough, their life begins to become a living question directed at the world around them. Not a comfortable question, but a disturbing one, because it reveals, without needing harsh words, that another way of existing is possible. And Enoch was beginning to become exactly that, a presence that questioned simply by being consistent, by not completely adapting, by not negotiating certain internal limits that were now firmly established. This phase also brought a new fear, more subtle than the fear of rejection, the fear of being responsible for what he would say. Enoch was beginning to understand that words spoken from the presence of God carry consequences that cannot be controlled, because once spoken, they do not return empty. They provoke reactions, divisions, and decisions. This demanded profound discernment, constant humility, and a willingness to remain faithful even when the immediate results were neither visible nor favorable. At the same time, there was a growing certainty that underpinned this fear, the certainty that he was not speaking from himself, nor from personal resentment, but from a communion that deepened day by day. And this certainty did not eliminate the risk, but made it bearable. For walking with God does not remove the danger, but redefines the reason why one accepts to face it. And Enoch was beginning to understand that his life no longer belonged to him in the same sense as before, for it had been aligned with something greater, something that demanded fidelity, even when it cost security. Enoch is no longer just a man who walks with God in silence, but someone whose walk begins to echo outward, still in a restrained way, but impossible to ignore. And the tension that now sustains the narrative is how this nascent voice will be received in a world that has built its stability on violence and denial. For the next step will require not only inner courage, but total surrender. And Enoch is about to cross a point where speaking what he sees will become as necessary as breathing, even knowing that this will put him on a direct path of confrontation with his own generation. There came a point when Enoch understood that what he carried within him could no longer be contained merely as personal conviction, because the clarity that came from his walk with God began to press him for expression, not as a desire to expose himself, but as a need for faithfulness, for there are truths that, when they mature sufficiently within someone, begin to demand a voice. And ignoring this demand generates a conflict even deeper than the fear of rejection, a conflict between remaining faithful to what one has received or protecting oneself from the consequences of proclaiming it. This inner pressure did not manifest as an uncontrolled impulse, but as a constant weight, as if each step taken in silence increased the accumulated responsibility. And Enoch began to realize that walking with God also meant sharing the weight of what God saw, what God felt, and what God knew about the path that generation was following. And this realization was not accompanied by spiritual pleasure, but by pain, because seeing clearly what others refuse to see almost always isolates the one who sees. Enoch then began to speak more clearly, not just in specific situations, but more directly, warning, exhorting, calling to conscience. And these words were not constructed to please, but to awaken, for they were laden with urgency, not aggression. And yet they provoked intense reactions, because a generation accustomed to justifying its own violence does not tolerate being confronted with the idea that its choices have consequences, and Enoch felt this firsthand in the way people distanced themselves, mocked him, accused him of exaggeration, or treated him as someone who had lost touch with reality. There is something profoundly human and painful in this moment, because Enoch did not speak as someone detached from the pain of others, but as someone who walked among those same people, who knew their stories, their struggles, their justifications, and yet needed to say what he saw, because walking with God does not allow compassion to be transformed into convenient silence. And this creates an unbearable tension for many, because loving and warning at the same time requires spiritual maturity that few are willing to develop. As time passed, his message began to take on more defined contours, for Enoch spoke not only of moral change, but of judgment, of inevitable consequences, of a limit that was being reached, and this increased the risk of his position, because speaking of judgment in a world that believes itself self-sufficient is to touch on the most sensitive point of human pride. And the reactions began to intensify, ranging from open mockery to veiled hostility, as few tolerate the idea that their way of life is not only imperfect, but dangerous. Jared watched this process with a heavy heart, for he recognized that his son had crossed a point of no return, one where the calling becomes public, and with it the protection of invisibility is lost. Although he wished to advise him to be prudent, he also knew that there was no longer any way to contain what God was doing through Enoch, for trying to silence a voice born from deep communion usually generates an irreparable inner rupture, and Enoch could no longer pretend not to see what he saw. There is an unavoidable spiritual principle here, because when someone becomes a spokesperson for what God reveals, even without titles or formal recognition, that person begins to live under constant tension as they carry a message that few want to hear, and at the same time need to keep their heart clean without allowing rejection to turn into bitterness. And Enoch struggled with this daily, seeking to remain aligned with God so that his words would continue to be an expression of truth and not of personal frustration. His message began to resonate beyond his immediate circle, reaching people who came out of curiosity, fear, or genuine unease. And while some approached seeking understanding, others approached with the intention of ridiculing or delegitimizing him, creating an increasingly tense atmosphere around his life. For now, Enoch was no longer just a different man, but an uncomfortable figure, someone who, by his very existence, exposed the moral fragility of his generation. Despite this, something surprisingly sustained Enoch, a growing intimacy with God that did not diminish in the face of opposition, but deepened, as if each human rejection pushed him even closer to the divine presence. This reveals something essential, because those who walk with God learn that human approval is fleeting, but true communion offers a stability that no collective acceptance can replace. Enoch began to live from this source, even knowing that the cost of this choice would only increase. Enoch is already fully immersed in his prophetic role, even though he doesn't recognize himself as such, since he doesn't seek labels, only faithfulness. The tension that remains now is how far this message will take him, how long he can continue speaking before the opposition becomes unbearable, and whether his walk with God will culminate only in growing rejection or in something that no one in that world could imagine, because history is approaching a point where God will intervene decisively, and Enoch is exactly at the center of this movement. Over the years, the distance between Enoch and his generation ceased to be merely moral or spiritual and became existential, because while the world around him became noisier, more violent, and more confident in its own autonomy, Enoch became quieter, more attentive, and more deeply aligned with what God revealed to him during his journeys. And this growing divergence made any neutral coexistence impossible, as there was no longer enough common ground to sustain superficial relationships without conflict. The rejection that had previously manifested itself in a veiled way began to take on clearer contours, as many no longer limited themselves to mocking or ignoring him, but began to treat him as someone dangerous, not because he represented a physical threat, but because he threatened the collective narrative of normality, because Enoch spoke of limits, of consequences, and of a God who had not abandoned the earth. And this message was unbearable for a generation that had built its identity on the idea that it was not accountable to anyone, and this created a constant climate of silent hostility around his life. This growing isolation could have destroyed someone less rooted, because living on the fringes of human approval wears down, corrodes, and deeply tests identity. But in Enoch, it produced a different effect, for the further the world distanced him, the more intense his communion with God became, as if the absence of superficial human ties opened up space for a spiritual depth that few have experienced. And this depth did not distance him from reality, but made him even more aware of what was at stake for his generation. During his walks, Enoch began to receive increasingly clear revelations, not only about the present but about the future, glimpses of a judgment that transcended his own time, images of a God who would come with power, accompanied by myriads, to confront all injustice. These revelations did not fill him with enthusiasm, but with weight, because seeing the end of a path before it happens requires carrying an anticipated pain that few can bear without hardening their hearts. And Enoch struggled to remain compassionate, even knowing that many would reject any call to repentance until the very last moment. There is something profoundly human in this stage of the journey, because Enoch needed to learn to live with the feeling of speaking to few, of being understood by almost no one, and yet remain faithful, for true faithfulness does not depend on a favorable response, but on alignment with what has been received. And this spiritual maturity is not born from success, but from perseverance in the midst of rejection, when the only confirmation available comes from the constant presence of God and not from human response. Jared was no longer always by his side, for time was advancing, generations were succeeding one another, and Enoch was beginning to perceive himself as someone traversing eras, speaking to different people, but repeating the same essential message, and this further amplified his solitude. For few managed to walk through centuries upholding the same truth without tiring, without negotiating, without softening what needs to be said. And yet Enoch remained, sustained by a communion that became ever deeper and more natural. This communion reached a level where God's presence was no longer perceived only in moments of reflection, but as a constant companion, so integrated into Enoch's life that the distinction between walking alone and walking with God began to dissolve, not in an exaggerated mystical way, but as a lived reality, for every decision, every word, and every silence was shared, and this produced such a profound transformation that Enoch began to reflect, albeit imperfectly, the character of the one with whom he walked. The world, in turn, was moving in the opposite direction, deepening its corruption, expanding its violence, and reinforcing its power structures, as if it wanted to prove, with each generation, that it did not need God. This contrast made Enoch's presence even more unsettling, as he became a living reminder that another way of existing was possible. And few tolerate being reminded of this when they have already invested everything in a path that allows no return without loss of status, power, or identity. Enoch is already in a rare state, deeply integrated with the presence of God and almost completely detached from the rhythm of his generation. living as someone who belongs more to what is to come than to what is passing. And the tension that now sustains the narrative is whether this extraordinary communion will continue only as a silent testimony, or whether it will culminate in something absolutely unprecedented. Because when a man walks long enough with God, the very logic of existence begins to be challenged, and Enoch is approaching a moment when the boundary between earth and heaven will cease to be merely symbolic. Over the centuries, something began to become evident even to those who resisted admitting any legitimacy in Enoch's life. Because while everyone around him aged, hardened, became more violent or more cynical, he remained strangely whole, not bound by the emotional wear and tear that time usually imposes, as if constant communion with God was producing in him a stability that could not be explained solely by temperament, discipline, or willpower. And this difference began to unsettle even the most hardened, for it revealed that closeness to God not only transformed character, but seemed to alter one's very relationship with time and with life. Enoch no longer spoke as frequently as before, not because he had given up on his message, but because he understood that at that stage, his very existence had become the message. For when words are repeatedly rejected, the silent testimony of an aligned life begins to speak more powerfully than any discourse. And this created a profound tension, because the world could ignore a preacher, but it could not ignore someone whose entire life belied the dominant narrative that violence, power, and absolute autonomy were the only possible path. His walk with God reached such a profound level of naturalness that it no longer seemed extraordinary in his own eyes, for what had previously required conscious effort now flowed like breath, as if the divine presence had become the natural environment of his soul, and this constant intimacy began to produce something even rarer, an inner freedom that did not depend on external circumstances. For Enoch no longer lived in reaction to rejection, fear, or loneliness, but from a communion that sustained him regardless of what happened around him. This state did not emotionally distance him from people, but it made his compassion deeper and, at the same time, more painful, because he clearly saw what few were willing to admit: that humanity's collective path was dangerously narrowing, advancing towards an irreversible breaking point. This vision produced no satisfaction whatsoever, only a silent lament, for Enoch understood that many would only realize their mistake when it was too late, and bearing this awareness required an almost superhuman spiritual maturity. There were times when Enoch felt the weight of being displaced, not only culturally, but ontologically, as if his life were already more connected to the reality of God than to the logic of the earth. And this feeling was not accompanied by a desire to escape, but by a strange serenity, as if he were being prepared for something that transcended the common experience of death, something he did not dare to formulate in words, but which began to insinuate itself as a silent possibility, sustained. By the depth of the communion he lived daily, those around him began to notice that Enoch no longer reacted in the same way to veiled threats, mockery, or isolation, as if such things no longer had real power over him. This provoked contradictory reactions, as some felt an uncomfortable reverence, while others felt growing anger, because Enoch's inner freedom exposed the emotional prison in which many lived, and few tolerate seeing before them someone who demonstrates, through their own life, that submission to violence and fear is not inevitable. Jared had been gone for a long time, as had many who had witnessed Enoch's first steps, and this historical solitude made his existence even more unique, for he carried the living memory of entire generations, having seen the world progressively drift away from God without ever losing clarity about what truly sustained life. And this broadened perspective made his walks with God even deeper, for they were not limited to the immediate present, but traversed time, connecting the beginning of humanity to its inevitable future. There is a very rare spiritual principle here, because when someone walks with God for long enough, their identity begins to shift from what is transient to what is eternal. And this does not mean despising the earth, but living on it from a different point of reference. Enoch began to reflect this reality so intensely that his own stay on earth seemed less and less necessary, as if his mission was being fulfilled not for lack of purpose, but for fullness of communion. Everything indicates that something absolutely unprecedented is about to happen, not as a response to the world, but as an expression of the unique relationship between Enoch and God. The tension that sustains the silence now is no longer whether Enoch will be faithful, for that is already established, but how God will respond to a life that has become, over centuries, a continuous journey of trust, communion, and alignment. For when someone walks with God for so long, there comes a point when the very logic of the separation between heaven and earth begins to be questioned. One day, Enoch went out for a walk, as he had done countless times throughout the centuries, without announcement, without witnesses, without any external sign that this moment would be different from the others, because for him, walking with God was no longer an extraordinary event, but the very way of existing. And this is profoundly significant, because the extraordinary, when lived long enough, becomes natural, and the natural, when aligned with God, transcends what men call normality. On that day, there was no urgency in Enoch's steps, nor any conscious expectation of something new, only the continuation of a communion that had already spanned generations, losses, rejections, and silence. And perhaps that is precisely what makes what happened next so impactful, because it was not an escape from the world, nor a dramatic getaway, but an almost inevitable consequence of a lifetime lived in relationship, as if the separation between walking on earth and walking with God no longer made sense. The sacred text describes this moment with disconcerting simplicity, saying only that Enoch walked with God and was no more, because God took him to himself, and this absence of details does not diminish the event. On the contrary, it amplifies it, for it reveals that there was no violent rupture nor traumatic transition, only continuity, as if Enoch had taken another step and, in that step, crossed an invisible boundary that separates time from eternity, not by human merit, but by intimacy, built over a lifetime. For those who knew him, his absence must have been deeply disturbing, for there was no body, no explanation, no closure, only the void left by someone who had always been there, and that void spoke louder than any discourse, because it confirmed everything that Enoch had lived and proclaimed, that God was not a distant idea, but a real presence, capable of intervening, calling, and welcoming those who choose to walk with him, even when the world chooses to go in another direction. For Enoch, however, there was no rupture, only fullness, because he who had learned to live before God now simply continued living with him, without the limitation of the flesh, without the weight of time, without the distance that separates the visible from the invisible. And this reveals something profoundly comforting, for it shows that intimacy with God is not interrupted by death, but in certain rare cases completely overcomes it, as an early sign of what he has in store for those who seek him with all their heart. Enoch's life thus becomes a testimony that transcends all generations, not as a promise of escape from death, but as an affirmation that life lived in communion with God is not wasted, even when it seems invisible, rejected, or lonely. Because what sustains this life is not human approval, but daily, silent, and persistent faithfulness that builds a relationship capable of overcoming even the most feared limit of human existence. There is a profound healing for the soul here, because many live in fear that a simple, quiet, and faithful life will go unnoticed, without meaning or reward. But Enoch reminds us that God sees, God accompanies, and God answers, not necessarily in the way we expect, but according to a logic that transcends time and redefines what it means to win. For Enoch's greatest victory was not being taken up without dying, but having lived in such a way that dying no longer made sense. The world continued its course toward destruction, as Enoch had foretold, and the flood would come, confirming that his words were not an exaggeration, but anticipated mercy. And yet his story remained, traversing the water, time, and human memory, like a constant whisper saying that it is still possible to walk with God, even when everything around seems lost, even when faithfulness costs too much, even when no one else seems willing to pay that price. At the end of this story, I don't invite you to try to repeat Enoch's experience, because that's beyond the reach of human will. But I invite you to something even deeper and more possible, to reconsider the rhythm of your own journey, to ask yourself if your life has been lived only in reaction to the world or in relationship with God, because Enoch wasn't taken by God for having done something spectacular, but for having walked step by step, day by day, century by century, until the distance between walking with God and living with Him simply ceased to exist. And perhaps that is precisely the most powerful hope that the story of Enoch leaves us with. That silent faithfulness is never invisible to the eyes of God, and that every journey undertaken in communion, even if rejected on earth, finds its fulfillment in eternity, where nothing that was lived with Him is lost, erased, or forgotten. Don't ignore this silent call if this story touched your heart. Subscribe to the Bible Teachers channel to continue journeying through profound biblical stories that not only inform but transform the way we live our faith. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos, and share this content with someone who needs a reminder that it's still possible to walk with God, even in difficult times. Here, we don't just seek biblical knowledge, we seek intimacy with God.